Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. Today I've got a real treat for you. Everyone has heard of the B-29. Even people who have no interest in aviation or history know of it. But even quite a few aviation fans might not be familiar with the B-32 Dominator. So let's chop the throttle and dive in. Back in 1939, the situation was distressing to say the least. War was breaking out in Europe, and on November 10th of that year, U.S. General Henry H. Hap Arnold, who was the acting head of the Army Air Corps, requested authorization to start studies for a very long-range VLR bomber that would be capable of carrying the fight well beyond the American continent. It had to be far superior in range, performance, bomb-carrying ability, and defensive armament compared to the existing aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. Approval for the VLR bomber project came quickly in December 1939, and only a month after that, the specifications were published. These were that the superbomber needed to have a speed of 400 miles per hour, a range of 5,333 miles, and a bomb load of 2,000 pounds. Later requests, which came about due to observations of what was going on in Europe, requested more defensive armament, more armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks. This request was sent to Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, and Lockheed. Lockheed and Douglas decided to pass on the offer, but Boeing and Consolidated rolled up their sleeves and went to work. In August 1940, the Army ordered 2 prototypes for what was now being called the B-29 from Boeing. But I guess the Army had heard the expression to not put all your eggs in one basket. So they also ordered 2 B-32 prototypes from Consolidated as a kind of Plan B, just in case the Boeing bird didn't work out. It was a good idea, really, as what was being asked of these companies was pretty demanding. It would kind of be like asking today's aircraft manufacturers to come up with plans for an X-wing fighter. Oh yeah, and one prototype needed to be delivered within 18 months, with another 90 days later, and another 90 days after that. So I guess it's understandable then that to save time and effort, that Consolidated started by adapting some of the features of the B-24. So the new bomber would also have a high-mounted Davis-type wing, twin tails, and a twin bomb bay, covered over by a set of roll-up doors. However, the fuselage would be more cylindrical, the wings would be bigger, and the nose more rounded that could be found on the Liberator. For crew comfort and to offer greater defensive effectiveness, the B-32 would have pressurized compartments and remotely controlled and retractable turrets. Both superbombers would have the same engines, 4 turbo-supercharged Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone air-cooled radials, although the B-32 would be fitted with 3 bladed props. The inboard propeller's pitch could actually be reversed to throw air forward, which would be used to shorten landing rolls or even to back up the aircraft in ground maneuvers. 4 months later, in December of 1940, static mock-ups had been put together, and based on those, in January 1941, 13 test YB-32s were ordered in addition to the 3 XB-32s. And now all Consolidated had to do was build these prototypes. Easy peasy, right? Wrong. Turns out it's hard to build a revolutionary next-generation aircraft. Both programs were 6 months late when the first XB-32 was rolled out on September 1st, 1942, even ahead of its Boeing Plan A bomber sister. Flight testing was to begin right away, but because of problems with the pressurization systems and gun turrets, these items had been left off the first XB-32. The first prototype took to the air on September 7th, 1942, but problems with one of the rudder trim tab actuating rods forced the test pilots to make an emergency landing after only 20 minutes in the air. That didn't look good, but at least the B-32 was flying. The B-29 wouldn't fly for another 2 weeks. But, although both superbombers were late and both programs were troubled, one seemed to be more troubled than the other. On May 10, 1943, the first B-32 prototype crashed just after takeoff due to a flap malfunction. 6 crewmen were injured, and Consolidated test pilot Richard McEachen was killed. Also, vital test records were destroyed in the crash, necessitating some testing to be repeated. Authorities seemed to be paralyzed about what to do with the program. In February 1943, the YB-32 contract had been cancelled. But the very next month, a contract for 300 production B-32s was placed, even though some USAAF leaders wanted to cancel the B-32 program outright, as the B-29 was now maturing rapidly. The second prototype finally flew for the first time on July 2, 1943. It had modified rudder tabs and was pressurized, and had the promised remotely controlled retractable gun turrets in the dorsal and ventral positions and a manned tail stinger. The third prototype flew on September 17, 1943, with the original twin-tail empennage. But it and its sisters had serious stability problems. Actually, the USAAF had a laundry list of things that needed fixing. Firstly, the defensive firepower of the B-32 was deemed to be inadequate, so now they wanted the remotely controlled turrets to be replaced by manned ones, with twin 50 cal machine guns installed in the nose, ventral, tail, and 2 dorsal positions. The engine nacelles needed changes, and 4-bladed propellers were to be swapped in. The pressurization system just wasn't working out, so it was decided that the B-32 would be bumped down to be working at lower or medium altitudes, and so the pressurization gear could be stripped out. There was a plus to doing this in that the weight saving could increase the maximum bomb load to 20,000 pounds. Here are some other things that needed fixing: the fuel system, the oil system, the bomb release system, the autopilot, and the emergency exits. It kind of makes one wonder, was there anything on the airplane that was good? One of the most obvious things was the change in the tail to improve stability. Dropping the twin tail concept, the third prototype had a single 16.5 foot tall vertical tail installed. It looked like a B-29 tail, and that makes sense as it was designed by Boeing. How embarrassing. But even that wasn't enough to solve the stability problem, and eventually a Consolidated designed 19-foot, 6-inch vertical tail was used. And this is what went into production, although it looks way too big. You may have heard the term big-ass bird, and it would certainly fit here. Amazingly, even with all these problems, contracts for 1,500 units were signed. The aircraft even had a naming problem. According to some sources, at one point, Dominator was considered, but then switched to Dominator. But then that was thought to be not appropriate for the post-war environment, and then it was supposed to be just referred to as the B-32, but the name Dominator stuck anyway. The very first B-32 delivered was written off on its very first day on September 19, 1944. Its nose wheel collapsed on landing, and the machine was scrapped. Not a great operational beginning. Actually, in terms of operational history, there nearly almost wasn't any. The B-32 still had many problems. Supposedly the instrument layout was poor and the cockpit had very high noise levels. Bombardier vision was reputedly rather bad, which isn't good for a bombing aircraft. As for the aircraft being overweight for the available engine power and prone to engine fires, well, the B-29 had been prone to those too. But there were also frequent landing gear failures. Was there anything good? Yes, the B-32 had very good low-speed directional control, good takeoff and landing characteristics, and rapid control responses. And after all the tail changes, the B-32 was a stable bombing platform, and its manned gun positions offered good protection. Its subsystems were easily accessible for maintenance, and its handy reversible inboard propellers gave it excellent ground handling characteristics. But still, the B-32 wasn't getting any action. Fortress, Superfortress, and Liberator units didn't really want to be evaluating the new plane. and so it seemed like it was going to be a plane without a purpose. And then Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, the commander of the Far East Air Forces, came along. He had been repeatedly asking for B-29s and had been repeatedly refused. So then he asked, "Hey, how about those B-32s? Is anyone using those?" And he was approved, and the first 3 machines were sent for evaluation. The B-32 finally actually saw combat on May 29, 1945 during a strike against a Japanese supply depot. 30% of the mission aborted. Well, there were only 3 airplanes, so when one machine turned back, it was a third of the force. They weren't bothered by fighters, and the Dominators were finally able to drop some bombs on target from 10,000 feet. Other attacks followed, hitting targets in the Philippines, Formosa, and on Hainan Island in the Tonkin Gulf. The tests were thus deemed to be a success, and plans were made to convert the 386th Bombardment Squadron to B-32s. Then the B-32's more popular cousin dropped atomic bombs on Japan. You'd think that after this, the book would be closed on the B-32's history, but no. This is where the Dominator actually secured its place in the history books. The unit moved to Okinawa and continued operations, even though there was technically a ceasefire in place. But when 2 foes had been going at it so hard, it was a tricky thing to break up the fight, even after the surrender on August 15th. For the most part, the ceasefire was observed. The B-32s flew mainly photographic reconnaissance missions. However, on August 17th, 4 B-32s flying over Tokyo were fired on by radar-directed AA and were attacked by Japanese fighters. The bomber escaped with only minor damage and was able to claim 1 confirmed fighter kill and 2 probables. So the question now was, would the Japanese forces actually observe the surrender or continue fighting piecemeal? The B-32 missions would continue in order to see. So, on 18th of August 1944, 4 Dominators took off on another photographic mission, and this time 50% of the force turned back. But during the mission, 14 A6M-0s and 3 N1K2J Scheiden K George fighters attacked the remaining 2 bombers. Either because they thought the US was breaking the ceasefire, or because they couldn't bear to see American bombers flying serenely, unopposed over a ruined Tokyo. Either way, they dove in and attacked. During the air battle, the B-32s claimed 2 Zeros destroyed and a probable George. One of the Dominators was badly hit, wounding 3 crew members. Sergeant Anthony Marchione, a photographer's assistant, was fatally wounded during the attack, and had the sad distinction to be the last American to die in air combat in World War II. Despite the battle damage, the Dominator made it back to Okinawa. Because of the incident, Japan was ordered to remove all of the propellers from their fighter aircraft. The very last Dominator mission of the war on August 28 was truly sad. Of the 4 bombers, 1 lost an engine on takeoff, skidded off the runway, and exploded and burned. All 13 men aboard died. On the way back, another B-32 lost 2 engines. The plane's pilot ordered the crew to bail out, but 2 men were killed in the process. It was an inauspicious end to a pretty inauspicious program. Perhaps that explains why all production was ceased in September and all B-32s were ordered for disposal. One was supposed to be kept for museum display, but all of them ended up being scrapped, and so no survivors exist at all. And so that is the end of the story of the Dominator. If you enjoy this kind of thing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Join our Patreon, and if you like to listen as well as watch, you could check out the audio podcast on Spotify or wherever, or even here on YouTube. Until next time.